The alpha who spent 2 years at the Conservation Academy making sure everyone knew I did not belong there, had to stand in front of her grandmother and 3 centuries of her family's name and ask me, the scholarship Omega she destroyed, to bond her, because I was the only person alive who could save the House of Aldermoor, and I said yes. And I want to be honest with you about why. I did not say yes for love. I said yes to watch her beg. I was 26, and Omega, a fine art conservator, the best in the country, though almost no one knew my name, and the woman who needed me badly enough to put a bond contract on the table. The woman who, 8 years before, had torn my thesis off the academy wall and called me a charity case with no eye for anything real in front of the whole studio, was Cressida Aldermoor. She was 30. She was an alpha.
Welcome everyone! Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
She was the sole heir of Aldermoor in Vane, the oldest fine art auction house in the country. 200 years of selling the world's masterpieces out of a marble hall on the grandest square in the city. And she was, when she came to me, the heir of a house 3 weeks from collapse, because the Aldermoor centenary sale was built around a painting that I, and only I, could tell you was a forgery. I'm going to tell you about the night the entire centenary gala, 300 of the richest collectors in the world, the press, the board, the woman who raised Cressida to be a weapon, went silent to watch Cressida Aldermoor stand up under the painting that was supposed to save her house and tell the truth. But I have to go back first, because the truth she told that night is not the part that mattered. The mattering had already happened 8 years before, in a studio that smelled of linseed oil and turpentine and a 19-year-old's humiliation, in front of a ruined canvas I spent 4 months of my life on, and have never, in 8 years, stopped seeing when I close my eyes. If you want the uncensored, too hot for YouTube version of this story, the parts I cannot tell here, it is on my Patreon, link in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me go back to the beginning of me, because the beginning of me is the only thing that explains why a grown woman would agree to bond the person who broke her and call it revenge and believe it. I grew up over my mother's framing shop in a part of the city. The auction house crowd drove through with the doors locked. My mother mended frames and restretched canvases for the small galleries that could not afford a real restorer. And I grew up with the smell of rabbit skin glue and the sound of her humming over a torn corner of some third-rate landscape. And somewhere in there, before I could properly read, I learned the thing that turned out to be the only valuable thing I have ever owned. I could see. I could look at a painting and see, underneath the dirt and the overpaint and the lies, what it had actually been, what the hand that made it had actually meant, where it had been wounded and where it had been faked. My mother saw it in me when I was 7 and could not afford to do anything about it except love it. And so she taught me everything she knew, which was a poor woman's everything. And it was enough to get me. At 18, the one scholarship the Aldermoor Conservation Academy gives each year to a student with no money and no name. Before all of it, there was my mother, and I have to put her in properly because she is the reason I survived what came. She would set a wounded canvas under the lamp and make me tell her what was wrong with it before she ever lifted a brush. And when I was 7, I told her that a restored portrait a dealer had brought in was a lie, that the woman's whole face had been repainted by a later, lesser hand. And she went very still and checked, and I was right. And she did not praise me. She was frightened for me. I understand that now. She spent my whole childhood trying to teach me to hide the one thing that made me worth anything. Because she knew, the way poor women know, that a gift without protection is only a target. I did not listen. That is the whole tragedy of me at 19. My mother handed me the lesson for free every day of my childhood, and I had to learn it instead from Cressida Aldermoor in a single afternoon at the cost of everything. And I want you to feel what it was to arrive at that academy, because it explains the rest. I had never in my life stood in a building like it. Marble and hush, and 4 centuries of the world's paintings studied by people who had grown up owning them. And I came up the steps that first morning in my mother's good coat, which was not good, carrying a box of her hand-me-down tools. And I understood inside the hour that I had walked into a country whose language I did not speak and never would. The other students had been raised inside it. They knew which name and which fork and which silence. They had stood in the houses whose collections we studied. They spoke of a Titian the way I spoke of my mother's regulars. I had the eye, and nothing else. And for one term, I told myself the eye would be enough, that surely, in a place built to teach people to see, the girl who could already see would be safe. I was so young. I had not yet learned the thing it took 8 years to teach me, that the places built to honor a gift are exactly the places most threatened by anyone who turns up already holding it without their permission. I want to tell you what that scholarship was, because you cannot understand what Cressida took from me unless you understand what it was she took. The academy was where you went to become a real conservator, the kind the great houses trust with the great paintings. And it took the children of the families who owned the art world, and it took, once a year, one of us, one scholarship omega from over a framing shop. And the unspoken thing everyone understood was that the one of us was there to be grateful, to keep our head down, to be the proof the academy could point to that it was not only for the rich and to never, under any circumstances, be better than the children of the families. I was better than the children of the families. I knew it the first week. I had the eye and they had the names, and the eye is the only thing in that world that cannot be bought. And I was 19 and stupid, and I did not yet understand that being better than the people who own the room is the single most dangerous thing a girl with no name can be. Let me tell you how I learned to be small, because it is the spine of everything after. My mother had taught me to be grateful and quiet. Keep your head down, do the work. Do not give them a reason. The small, fierce theology of a woman who has spent her life mending other people's treasures for less than they paid for the frame. And I carried it into the academy like armor. And it was not enough armor, because the thing my mother never understood, having never been allowed near a room like that, was that for a girl like me, the work itself was the provocation. I could not be both invisible and the best, and I was the best, and so I learned, at 19 in a single ruinous afternoon, that the rooms that belong to the great will forgive a poor girl anything, except being more gifted than their children. I have spent 8 years since being quietly the best in the country and making very sure that no one in any room ever sees me be it. I do my work, and I send the invoice, and I let the great houses put their own names on what my eye saved. I made myself a pair of eyes attached to as little woman as I could manage. It kept me fed, and it kept me safe, and it kept me, for 8 years, exactly as small as the afternoon Cressida Aldermoor taught me to be. Until the house that taught me the lesson needed the eye it had tried to put out. And I discovered that small is a place you can leave. I should tell you who Cressida was at the academy, because the easy version is the rich bully, and the true version is the thing it took me 8 years in a forced bond to actually see. And I am only going to be able to tell you the easy version first, because the easy version is the only one I had for 8 years. Cressida Aldermoor arrived at the academy the way weather arrives. She was the heir. Not a scholarship, not a hopeful, the heir. The girl whose family's name was carved over the door, whose grandmother had endowed the building we stood in. And she was beautiful in the cold, expensive way that the truly old families are beautiful. Dark and sharp and certain. And she was, everyone agreed, enormously talented. Which I believed for exactly one term, until I understood that what Cressida had was not an eye, but a memory. She could reproduce anything flawlessly, the most gifted copyist the academy had seen in a generation, and she could not, for all the family in her blood, see what was real. She could make you a perfect Caravaggio. She could not tell you whether the Caravaggio in front of her was one. And I could. And we both knew it by the end of the first term. And that, I understand now 8 years late, was the beginning of the end for me. Because the one thing the heir of the greatest authentication house in the country could not afford to be, the one thing her terrifying grandmother would never forgive, was a girl who could copy anything and authenticate nothing, standing next to a charity case who could see straight through the world. She made my life a precise, sustained 2-year campaign of small cruelties, the kind that never leave a mark a teacher can act on, the kind that the rest of the studio learns to laugh at so they will not be next. And I bore it, head down, the way my mother taught me, because I thought if I were small enough, it would pass. Let me give you the shape of it, because bullying is a child's word for a thing that was done with an adult's precision. It was never anything a teacher could act on. It was my tools going missing the night before an assessment and turning up after in the lost property, where I would have to ask for them in front of everyone. It was the solvent on my bench mislabeled so that a week's work lifted off the panel in a single ruinous wipe, and no way on earth to prove it was not my own clumsiness. It was Cressida reading my technical reports aloud in that bored, amused voice, finding the one provincial phrase, the one place my framing shop vocabulary showed, and holding it up for the studio to enjoy, so that I learned to dread my own writing. It was being not invited, always, in the most visible possible way. The studio dinners, the gallery trips, the small alliances that are how a young conservator actually builds a life, so that I was alone in a way that looked from outside like I had simply failed to be likable. And it was the studio learning, the way studios do, that the safe thing was to laugh with her, so that by the second year I was not being tormented by one rich girl. I was being quietly disappeared by an entire room that had decided I was the acceptable cost of staying on the right side of an Aldermoor. I told no one at home. My mother thought I was thriving. I let her think it, because the one thing worse than living it was watching her face if she knew the lesson she'd tried to spare me was being taught to me anyway, with interest. It did not pass. It escalated, the way these things escalate when the target refuses to break, and it ended in our second year with my thesis. My thesis was a painting. I have to make you understand what it was, because everything Cressida did and everything I became turns on it. It was a small, ruined 17th century portrait of a woman, a nothing painting, bought for almost nothing by the Academy as a teaching wreck, water-damaged, overpainted by 3 later centuries of bad hands, written off by every instructor as beyond saving, a thing to practice failure on. And I had spent 4 months with it, every night, alone in the studio after the family children had gone home to their good dinners. And I had found her, under the dirt and the overpain and the lies, under 3 centuries of other people's mistakes. There was a real woman painted by a real and frightened and gifted hand, and I had brought her back. Not faked her, not invented her, found her, which is the only honest kind of restoration there is. And on the morning of the thesis review, she hung on the studio wall, alive again after 400 years. And for 1 hour, she was the best thing in that building. And everyone in it knew it, and so did I. I have to tell you what those 4 months were, because they were the truest thing I had ever done. I worked on her every night after the family children went home to their good dinners, alone with the lamp and the slow, almost unbearable patience of lifting 3 centuries of other people's mistakes off her 1 square millimeter at a time, the grime and the yellowed varnish and the overpaint where lesser hands had fixed her into something cheaper than she was. And underneath, night by night, she came back, a real woman by a real hand 400 years dead, frightened and gifted and alive, with an expression the overpaint had flattened to nothing. And that turned out, when I cleared it, to be the most human thing I had ever seen on a canvas. I did not invent her or improve her or copy anyone. I found what was already truly there, which is the only honest restoration there is, and the one kind Cressida, for all her gifted hands, could never do. By the last week, I was not restoring a teaching wreck. I was keeping company with the only soul in that building who never once made me feel small, and who happened to have been dead 400 years. So you understand what it was then, that hung on the wall that morning? It was not a class assignment. It was the proof of me. And Cressida took her off the wall. In front of the whole studio, in front of the visiting board, she lifted my 4 months and 400 years off the wall, and she said, loudly, lightly, in the bored, certain voice of a girl who has never once been told no, that it was a charming effort but obviously a fake, that no scholarship student could have done genuine work of that quality, that I must have bought it restored or had help, and that in any case I had no eye for anything real and never would. And she set my painting face down on the work table with the others, the failures, and she walked away. And the studio laughed, the small relieved laugh of people who are glad it is not them. And the board wrote down what the heir of Aldermoor said, because the heir of Aldermoor's word about what is real is, in that world, the only word there is. My scholarship was not renewed. I left the academy at 20 with the best eye in my year and a permanent quiet mark on my name, the scholarship girl whose work didn't hold up. And I went home over the framing shop. And I did not stop being a conservator because it was the only thing I am. But I never again let anyone in that world see my face on my work. I built a different kind of career, in the dark, behind other people's names. The conservator, the great houses call in secret when they need to actually know. The eye they trust precisely because she has no name to protect and no interest in the credit. And I became, in 8 quiet years, the best in the country, and a person no one in the bright rooms had ever heard of, which is exactly how I wanted it, and exactly how it stayed until the House of Aldermoor staked its survival on a painting and needed someone with an eye to bless it, and there was only one eye good enough, and it was mine. Let me tell you what those 8 years actually were, because the easy version is that I disappeared, and the true version is that I won, quietly, in the dark, where no one could take it from me. I never set foot in a bright room again. I worked through intermediaries, by a reputation passed in whispers among the people who actually know. The conservator you call when the stakes are too high to trust a name, the eye that has no name to protect, and therefore cannot be bought or flattered or frightened. I told a museum once, through 3 layers of lawyers, that the crown of its new wing, a rediscovered master it had paid a fortune for, was a period fake, and I was right, and the museum quietly sent it back and never learned the name of the woman who had saved it from the worst scandal of its century. I authenticated, in the dark, half the great private collections in the country. I became, without anyone in the light ever seeing my face, the single most trusted eye in the trade, and I did it deliberately, so that no second Cressida Aldermoor could ever again stand up in front of a room and decide, with nothing but her name, that my work was a lie. I made myself unkillable by making myself invisible. It was a good plan. It was a small life. It was exactly the life her afternoon had taught me to want, and I called it freedom, right up until the house that built the cage came to my mother's shop begging for the key. The call came through 3 layers of intermediaries, the way the great houses always reach for me, and I almost said no before I knew whose it was. And then I heard the name Aldermoor, and I went very still in my mother's old shop. And I said yes to the meeting for a reason that was not professional at all. Aldermoor and Vane was dying. I knew it the way the whole quiet trade knew it. 200 years of grandeur run thin, a string of bad seasons, debts that the marble hall on the Grand Square could no longer hide. And I knew, the way the trade knew, that they had staked everything on the centenary sale, and that the centenary sale was built around a single painting, a newly rediscovered masterwork, a portrait by a hand worth more than the rest of the sale combined. The painting that, if it sold for what they said it was worth, would carry the house back into the light for another generation. And they needed it authenticated beyond any doubt, by an eye no buyer could question, because a rediscovered masterwork worth that much draws doubters the way blood draws sharks. They needed the best independent eye in the country. They needed me. And the terrible, delicious thing, the thing I sat with for a long time in my mother's shop, was that I had already seen the painting, in the catalog, in a single high-resolution plate, and I already knew, the way I have always known, the thing that the House of Aldermoor could not afford for anyone to know. It was a forgery, a magnificent one, the most gifted copyist's forgery I had ever seen, and I knew, looking at that plate, in my mother's shop with 8 years of being small coming off me like dust, exactly whose hand had made it. Whose? She came to me herself in the end. That is the part I did not expect. I had expected a lawyer, an intermediary, a contract slid across a table by a functionary. And instead, Cressida Aldermoor came in person to my mother's framing shop, into the rabbit skin glue and the third-rate landscapes, in a coat that cost more than the building. And she stood among the wreckage of the world she had thrown me back into 8 years before. And I watched her recognize it, and I watched it cost her something. And I said nothing, because I had learned long ago that the great talk to fill a silence, and you learn everything by refusing to. I had spent 8 years imagining what I would feel if I were ever in a room with her again, and I had imagined every version except the true one, which was pity. And I hated that it was pity. She stood among my mother's third-rate landscapes in a coat worth more than the building, and she could not hide that she was unraveling, the heir of Aldermoor, come down to a framing shop in the locked door part of the city to beg the charity case. I let the silence do its work, and in it I read her the way I read a canvas, which is the only way I know how to read anything. And what I saw under the expensive coat was not the certain girl from the studio. It was a woman who had not slept, who was carrying something too heavy to set down, who flinched, actually flinched, at the smell of rabbit skin glue, as if my whole childhood were an accusation laid against her. The girl from the academy had looked at me as if I were beneath noticing. The woman in my mother's shop could not look at me at all. I did not know yet what that meant. I assumed it was the simple shame of needing me. It was that, but it was also 8 years of a thing I would not understand until much later, and I am glad I did not understand it then, because if I had, I might have been kind too soon, and she had not earned kind yet, and a kindness given before it is earned is only another kind of lie. She was not the girl from the academy. That was the first crack in the story I had carried for 8 years. The girl from the academy had been certain, bored, untouchable. The woman in my mother's shop was none of those things. She was tired in a way money cannot fix, and she was frightened, and this was the thing I could not file anywhere, ashamed. Before she had said a single word, ashamed of the shop and of being in it and of why she had come. And she stood there in her impossible coat, and she did the thing I would have bet my eyes she was incapable of. She said my name correctly, and she said, "I know what I did to you. I'm not here to pretend I don't. I'm here because my family's house will be gone in a month, and the only person in the world who can save it is the one I made sure would never want to. I'm aware of what that makes me." And then she told me what she was asking, and it was so much worse and so much better than I had imagined that I had to sit down on my mother's stool to hear it. The board of Aldermoor in Vane did not want to simply hire me. A hired eye can be doubted, can be bought, can talk. The trade knew the scholarship girl story. An independent authentication from a no-name conservator the house had once discredited would raise exactly the questions they could not survive. What the board wanted, what the grandmother, Augusta Aldermoor, the woman who had built Cressida into a weapon, had decided was to make the eye theirs, unimpeachably, permanently, in the one way the old families have always made a thing theirs, a bond, a marriage of the house to the conservator. Aldermoor and Vane and the best eye in the country joined, so that my authentication of the centenary painting would be the word of a woman bound to the house, and so that I could never, ever be the eye that brought them down. They would pay, of course, a sum that would have made my mother weep, a sum that would have set my family up for life, and the alpha I would be bound to, the heir whose name I would carry, the woman whose grandmother had decided to buy my eye with a bond, was the woman who had taught me I had no eye at all. I want you to understand the shape of what was on the table, because it is the most important thing in this story. Cressida Aldermoor, the alpha who had broken me, was being made to come to me, the omega she had broken, and ask me to save her, to put her name and her house and her grandmother's 200 years into the hands of the charity case, and trust that I would not close my fist. The power had not just shifted, it had inverted completely, and we both knew it. And I sat on my mother's stool in the smell of rabbit skin glue, and I felt 8 years of being small turn, in a single afternoon, into something with teeth. I did not decide quickly, whatever it looked like from the outside. I sat with it for 3 days in my mother's shop, and I want to be honest about everything that was in the scale, because the noble version where I only wanted the truth is a lie, and I have promised you none of those. There was my family. The sum the board was offering meant my mother would never restretch another stranger's cheap canvas for rent money as long as she lived, meant the small precarious people I was responsible for would be, for the first time in my life, safe. And I am not so proud that I will pretend that did not weigh more than anything else. There was the truth about my thesis, which a bond into the house would finally give me the standing to drag into the light 8 years after they buried it. And there was the thing I am least proud of, and that was, if I am honest, the heaviest of the three. The chance to be, for once, the one who holds the verdict. For 2 years, she had owned the question of what was real in every room we shared, and her word had ended me with a sentence, and now her house and her name and her grandmother's 200 years were going to depend entirely on the word of the girl she had taught to have no word at all. I knew it was not a clean reason. I took it anyway. You have to have been made very small for a very long time to understand how much a person will trade for the simple chance to finally be the one who gets listened to. I said yes. I said yes for my family, who would never want for anything again. I said yes for the truth about my thesis, which I intended to drag into the light. And I said yes, God forgive me, for the oldest and least noble reason there is. Because the girl who told me I had no eye for anything real was going to spend the rest of her life bound to the eye that could end her with a sentence. And I wanted to be there, up close, to watch her live with it. I told myself that was revenge. It took me a long time to understand that revenge is just the name the wounded give to the wish to finally be seen by the person who refused to see them. We were bonded in a registry office with 2 of the board as witnesses. No gala, no announcement yet. The announcement was being saved for the centenary, for maximum effect. And I went to live in the Aldermoor house on the Grand Square, 200 years of marble and old masters and cold. And I began, on the first night, the campaign I had promised myself. I made Cressida Aldermoor live with the eye she had tried to put out. I was good at it. I had 8 years of being small to spend, and I spent it like a woman who has been saving. I did not rage. Rage is for people without leverage. I was instead perfectly, unbearably correct. I authenticated nothing without being asked twice. I let her watch me look at the centenary painting, her forgery, the one I had not yet said a word about, for a long, long time, in silence, and then say nothing at all, and walk away, and let her lie awake not knowing what I had seen. I made her feel, every day, the precise thing she had made me feel for 2 years, that her place in her own house depended entirely on the verdict of a person who would not be hurried and would not be read and held all the power and showed none of it. I was, in short, exactly the alpha she had been to me, in an omega's body, with an I instead of a name. And I am not proud of how good it felt, and I am not going to pretend it did not feel like the first warm thing in 8 years. And Cressida let me. That was the thing I could not account for, the thing that started, slowly, to come apart in my hands. She did not fight me. She did not pull rank in her own house. She took it, the silence, the correctness, the power held over her head. She took all of it with a kind of terrible patience, the patience of a person who has decided that whatever I did to her, she had it coming, and would not, on principle, defend herself against the bill. I had built my whole revenge on the assumption that she was still the certain untouchable girl from the academy, that there would be a wall to break, a satisfaction in the breaking. There was no wall. There was a woman who agreed with me about herself, completely, who had been agreeing with me about herself, I would learn, for 8 years. And a revenge with nothing to push against is not a revenge. It is just 2 people in a cold house, one of them waiting to be punished, and the other one discovering, to her horror, that she does not actually want to be a punisher. I want you to feel what that cold house was in those first weeks, because it is where the revenge I had carried for 8 years quietly died of its own success. The Aldermoor house on the Grand Square was 200 years of marble and old masters, and a silence you could drown in. and Cressida moved through it like a tenant in a building being repossessed, which she was. We ate at opposite ends of a table built for 40. We did not speak unless the house required it. And every day I performed with great care the exact thing she had performed at me for 2 years. The bored correctness, the verdict withheld, the power held over the head of someone who can do nothing but wait. And every day she took it, without once pulling rank in her own home, with the flat patience of a woman paying a bill she has long known was coming due. I kept waiting for the satisfaction. I had built 8 years of survival, on the certainty that watching her squirm would feel like being made whole. Instead, night after night in that marble dark, I felt the thing I least expected, the slow horror of understanding that I was becoming, in that house, the very thing that had ruined me, and that the woman at the far end of the table was not fighting it, was not the certain untouchable girl I had armored myself against for 8 years, but someone who agreed with my lowest opinion of her so completely that there was nothing left in her to break. The thing that undid the story I had carried for 8 years did not come from Cressida. She never once tried to explain herself, never once offered me the excuse I was braced to refuse. It came from the house, from the old curator, Dame Esquith, who had run the Aldermoor archive for 40 years and had been at the academy, that year, on the visiting board, and who came to find me one evening among the cold old masters with the particular directness of the very old. "You think you know what happened in that studio," she said. "You know half of it." And she told me the other half. She told me that the year before Cressida tore my thesis off the wall, Augusta Aldermoor had brought her granddaughter, the heir, the future of the house, the girl whose word about what is real would one day be the word the whole trade trusted, to a specialist, quietly, and confirm the thing the family had feared since Cressida was a child, that Cressida had the most gifted hands the Academy had seen in a generation and no eye at all, that she could copy anything and authenticate nothing, that the heir to the greatest authentication house in the world was, in the one way that mattered, blind. And that Augusta had told her granddaughter, in the cold way Augusta told her everything, that this could never be known, that the house would not survive it being known, and that Cressida's entire life would now be a performance of an eye she did not have, propped up forever by the real experts she would hire and control, and never ever let outshine her. And then, Dame Esquith said, a scholarship girl walked into her studio with the best natural eye any of us had seen in 30 years. You were not her victim, child. You were her nightmare-made flesh, the proof, standing 3 feet away every day, of exactly the thing her grandmother had told her would destroy them all. What she did to you was unforgivable. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am telling you that she did it as a terrified 19-year-old who had just been told she was a fraud, who would have to fake it for life, looking at a girl who was everything she was supposed to be and could never be. She did not break you because you were beneath her. I did not forgive her. I want to be very clear about that because the easy version of this story is that I learned why and my anger melted, and that is not what happened. And it would be an insult to the 19-year-old in the studio if I let you believe it. Understanding why a person hurt you is not the same as deciding it was all right. And the conservator's whole discipline is the refusal to let a beautiful explanation overpaint an ugly truth. What Dame Esquith gave me was not absolution for Cressida. It was something harder and more useful. It was the real painting under the overpaint. For 8 years, I had carried a flat, simple picture. The rich girl, the cruelty, the charity case. And now I could see what was actually underneath it. The frightened, gifted blind heir, and the monstrous grandmother, and the scholarship girl who was, to that terrified 19-year-old, not a person at all, but the shape of her own doom. And the truth was not prettier than the flat picture, but it was real. And I cannot, it turns out, unsee a real thing once I have seen it. That is the curse of the only gift I have. And I want to be careful here, because this is the part people always get wrong when they hear the story, The part where they want me to say that understanding became forgiveness, and forgiveness became love, one tidy slope downhill. It did not work like that, and it matters to me that you know it did not. For the sake of the 19-year-old in the studio who is still in some locked room of me, hanging her painting on the wall. Understanding why Cressida hurt me did not make it hurt less. It did not retroactively turn 2 years of precise cruelty into a misunderstanding, or a secret kindness, or a love that had been there all along. It was none of those comfortable things. It was real and chosen, and it cost me my scholarship and 8 years of my own face. What the understanding did was smaller and stranger than forgiveness. It took away my permission to keep her flat. For 8 years, she had been a villain, and a villain is a very restful thing to own, a person you are allowed to hate without complication, cleanly, forever. And now she was a person instead, a gifted, blind, terrified, grandmother-broken person who had done a genuinely unforgivable thing for reasons that explained it without excusing it 1 inch. And you cannot hate a whole person the clean way you can hate a villain. I did not forgive her. I simply lost the ability to lie to myself that she was simple. And once you have lost that with someone, you are in far more danger than hatred ever put you in. Hatred is safe. It is seeing them whole that ruins you. So I stopped for a while, being corrected her like a knife, and I started, instead, watching her the way I watch a painting I have not yet understood. And what I saw over the cold weeks in that house was a woman drowning in plain sight, performing for a grandmother and a board and a whole trade, an eye she did not have, while the house her family had run for 200 years died around her of the rot her grandmother would not let anyone name. I saw her stay up until 3, reading authentication reports she could not fully judge, trying to learn by force a thing that cannot be learned. The more I watched, the worse it got. Worse because it grew harder and harder to keep hating her with the clean, total hatred that had kept me upright for 8 years. I saw her take a call from a board member and say the word authenticated about a painting she could not possibly have judged. And I watched her hate herself for saying it. I saw her at a dinner the dying house still had to host. Accept a collector's praise for the famous Aldermoor eye, with a smile that did not reach anywhere near her own, performing in real time the exact fraud her grandmother had sentenced her to perform for the rest of her life. I saw a woman who had everything I had been denied: the name, the room, the family, the word that ends every argument. And who would have traded all of it, I slowly understood, for the one thing I had been born with over a framing shop, and she could not buy at any price. It is a strange and terrible thing to discover that the person who destroyed you out of what looked like superiority did it, in fact, out of the purest envy, that the gap between us she could not bear was real, and ran in my favor, and always had. For 8 years I had believed she looked down on me. She had been looking up the entire time, and hating what she saw, and what she saw was me. And I saw, one night, in the locked conservation room she did not know I had a key to, the thing that broke the last of my revenge clean off in my hand. My thesis. The ruined 17th century woman I had brought back to life, and Cressida had called a fake and set face down on the failure's table 8 years before. She had not let it be thrown out. She had taken it. She had kept it for 8 years, in a locked room in her own house, restored exactly as I had left it, hung alone on the wall where she could see it, the single most real thing she would ever be near, the proof of the eye she would have given her name to have, kept like a wound she would not let heal, by the woman who gave it to me. I stood in that locked room for a long time, longer than I have ever stood in front of any painting in my life, and I am not ashamed to tell you that I wept, because I finally understood what I had been looking at for 8 years and getting completely wrong. I had thought she destroyed my thesis because she despised it. But you do not keep, for 8 years, in a locked room in your own house, restored to the exact state you found it, a thing you despise. You keep a thing like that the way you keep the evidence of your worst sin where you must see it every day, or the way you keep the one beautiful thing you were never allowed to have. It was both, for her, I think, My ruined woman had hung on Cressida Aldermoor's wall for 8 years as a confession and a longing at once, the proof of the eye she would have traded her name to possess, and the proof of what she had done to the girl who had it for free. She had been living all that time with my best work and her worst act framed together, looking at both every single day, while I had imagined she walked out of that studio and never thought of me again. She had thought of me every day. I had simply had the meaning of it exactly backwards, the way I'd had everything about her backwards, until a locked room and a key she didn't know I had said it right. It would be a cleaner story if the only thing left to settle were the two of us. It was not. There was the centenary, and there was the painting, and there was Augusta Aldermoor. The grandmother had not bonded me to her house so that I could heal her granddaughter. She had bonded me to silence me, to make the eye that could see her forgery into a thing that belonged to the family and could be controlled by it. And as the centenary sale came on, and the day approached when I would be expected to stand up and lend my authentication to the masterwork that was the house's whole salvation, Augusta made it clear, in the cold way she made everything clear, exactly what I had been bought for. I was to bless the painting. I was to put my eye, the eye the whole trade would one day learn was the real Aldermoor eye, behind the great rediscovered masterwork. And I was never to say the word that I and Cressida and Augusta herself all knew was true, that the painting was a forgery, and that the hand that had made it, the most gifted copyist of her generation, the heir who could reproduce anything and authenticate nothing, was Cressida. That was the thing I had not let myself fully see until the centenary was a week out. Cressida had painted it. Of course she had. Augusta had finally found a use for the one gift her granddaughter actually had. If you cannot authenticate the masterworks, make one, and use the family's unimpeachable name to sell the lie and bind the one eye that could expose it into the family so it never can. The centenary was not a sale. It was a crime, and Cressida was the hand, and I was to be the alibi. And Augusta Aldermoor had arranged all three of us on the board like pieces, the way she had arranged everything for 50 years. Augusta summoned me once, before the centenary, to be certain I understood the terms of what I had been bought for, and I have met a great many frightening people in this trade, and never one like her. She was past 80 and entirely without warmth, and she did not threaten me. Threats are for people who are not certain of their power. She simply explained, the way you explain a fact of nature to a slow child, that my eye now belonged to the house, that my authentication of the centenary painting was the consideration for which the house had paid in a bond and a fortune, and that whatever I might privately believe about that painting was, like everything else about a scholarship girl, of no consequence to anyone. She told me she had built her granddaughter, and she would build me too, that the house had been arranging useful people for 2 centuries, and that I would discover, as Cressida had, that there was no edge of the board she had not already mapped. And the most chilling thing she said, the thing I have never been able to put down, she said about Cressida, in the flat tone you'd use to note a tool's limitation, "My granddaughter cannot see what is real. It is the great disappointment of my life. But she can make what is real flawlessly, and you can see it. And between the two of you, I finally have one whole eye, owned outright." She did not see 2 people standing in front of her. She saw a single working instrument she had assembled out of 2 broken girls, and she was, in her cold way, almost content about it. And I walked out of that room understanding, for the first time, exactly what had shaped the girl who had shaped me. And then Cressida did the thing that ended Augusta's game and began my real life. 3 nights before the centenary, she came to the conservation room where I was standing in front of my own resurrected thesis, and she did not know I had been weeping in front of it. And she stood in the door, and she said the truest thing anyone had ever said to me, which was, "Don't bless it. Whatever else you do to me, and you can do anything, you've earned all of it. Don't put your eye behind my forgery. It's the one thing I can't let her make you do. You're the only person who ever saw what was real in this entire rotten house, and I will not be the reason you sell a lie. If the house has to die, Let it die honest. The centenary gala was the night the whole trade came to the marble hall on the Grand Square. 300 of the richest collectors in the world, the press, the board, the grandmother on her chair like a throne. And it was meant to be the night the great rediscovered masterwork was unveiled, and my authentication announced, and the House of Aldermoor carried back into the light. And it would have worked. The lie was beautiful enough. It would have worked if Cressida Aldermoor had been willing to be saved by it. She was not. She stood up under the painting she had made with her own gifted blind hands, in front of 300 people and the press and the board and the grandmother who had built her into a weapon and a forger. And she took the microphone and she told the truth, all of it, that the masterwork was a forgery, that she had painted it, that she had no eye, had never had an eye, that the heir of the greatest authentication house in the world was the most gifted copyist of her generation and could not tell you what was real to save her life, and that the only true eye in the room, the only true eye she had ever known, belonged to a scholarship omega she had destroyed 8 years before for the crime of being everything she could not be, the woman she had then let her grandmother buy and bind and try to turn into the alibi for the family's last and greatest lie. She said it all, into the silence, while Augusta's face turned to stone, and the press wrote, and the House of Aldermoor died in real time in front of the people who owned the art world. And she ended it looking not at the crowd, but at me, at the back where I stood among the staff, the way I had stood at the back of the studio 8 years before. And she said the words that inverted the sentence I had carried for 8 years. I told her once that she had no eye for anything real. The truth is, she is the only real thing this house ever had near it, and I have spent 8 years keeping her ruined masterpiece on my wall, because it was the only honest thing I owned. I have nothing left to offer her. No house, no name, after tonight, not even a future. But she deserves to hear it said out loud in the room where I said the opposite. I was wrong. She has the only real eye I have ever seen. And I would burn this entire 200-year-old house down again, on purpose, every night, rather than let it make her sell a lie. I have to tell you what it was to stand at the back of that hall and watch her do it, because I had dreamed of her ruin for 8 years, and the reality was nothing like the dream. The dream had been triumphant. The reality was the most frightening and the most magnificent thing I have ever watched a person do. 300 of the richest people in the world, who had come to bid on a masterpiece, sat in a silence so total I could hear the shudder of the press cameras, and Augusta Aldermoor's face in the front row went the color of old wax and did not move, not once, while her granddaughter took 200 years apart with her own mouth. I had spent the whole bond plotting how I would be the one to expose them. I had the leverage. I had planned to stand up. And Cressida took it out of my hands. Not to save herself, the opposite. She fell on the truth so that I would never have to be the one who threw it. And I understood, standing at the back among the staff where I had always stood, that she had finally, 8 years late, found the one thing that might actually reach me. She used the only real gift she had. The performance, the standing up in front of a room, the very thing her grandmother had built her for, to tell the truth instead of a lie, at the cost of everything, in the exact register in which she had once destroyed me. She gave the speech that ended her in the same voice she had used to end me. It was, I want to be clear, a catastrophe. She had not saved the house. She had detonated it in public with the press in the room, and there is no coming back for an auction house that announces its own forgery at its own centenary. Augusta Aldermoor's 200 years ended that night in front of everyone, and the board scattered, and by morning the marble hall was a crime scene and a punchline, and Cressida had, with her eyes open and her own hand, destroyed the only thing she had ever been raised to protect. She had nothing left. She had done it anyway. She had done it for the one thing the most gifted forger of her generation had finally decided was worth more than a flawless lie, which was a true thing. Me, said out loud. The matter of the forgery went, as these matters do, to the one authority the trade still answered to. The old curator, Dame Esquith, called in by the regulators as the independent expert of record, the woman who had told me the other half of the story. And before she gave her report, she came to find me one more time among the wreckage, and she asked me the only question that mattered, the question the whole 8 years came down to. "Child," she said, "you can finish it now if you want to. Augusta is finished, the house is finished, but Cressida, you can still bury. One word from you to the regulators about how long you knew, about the bond, about what you were brought here to do, and she does not just lose the house, she loses everything, possibly her freedom. Or you can tell them the truth, which is that the only person in that family who ever told the truth in 200 years was the one who told it at the centenary, at the cost of everything she had. You have wanted for 8 years to watch her pay. She is paying. I had come into that house to watch her beg, had built a whole revenge on it, had earned it 8 times over, and standing in the wreckage of her family's 200 years with the power to end her entirely in my hand, I found that I did not want to, and that I had not wanted to for some time, and that the not wanting was not weakness or forgiveness, but the clearest thing my eye had ever seen. "No," I told Dame Esquith, "I don't. She destroyed me when she was a frightened 19-year-old who had just been told she was a fraud, and that was unforgivable, and I have not forgiven it, and I am not going to pretend the why makes it all right. But she just stood up in front of everyone she was raised to impress and destroyed herself to keep me from selling a lie, knowing I could still bury her after, knowing she'd earn my burying her, and doing it anyway for nothing, because it was true. That is not the girl from the studio. That is a person who spent 8 years keeping my ruined painting on her wall and learning, the hard way, the only thing I have ever known, that a real thing is worth more than a perfect lie. I came here to watch her pay. She paid. And I find I don't want a world with one less honest person in it, even if it cost me 8 years to get her there. Tell the regulators the truth. All of it. Including that I knew and why, and that when I could have closed my fist, I opened it. Dame Esquith looked at me with her 40 years of catching liars, and she did not catch one, and she nodded, and she said, "Your mother taught you to mend ruined things, I think." And she went to give her report, and she gave it true. And the law, which is sometimes stupid and was for once not, made its distinction between the woman who built the forgery into a family's whole future and the woman who confessed it at the cost of her own. And Cressida Aldermoor lost the house and the name and the future, and did not lose the one thing she had detonated all of it to keep. There was a night after that I have not told you about, and it is the one I think about most. The house was gone, the bond a strange knot we had not yet decided how to untie, and Cressida came to me where I stood, where else, in front of my own thesis, the ruined 17th century woman she had kept on her wall for 8 years, the last thing left in the emptied house worth looking at. And she did not ask me for anything. She had learned, finally, the thing it took losing everything to learn, which is that you do not get to ask the person you broke to make you feel better about the breaking. We stood there a while, the two of us and the painting, in a house emptied of everything but the one thing in it that was real. And I thought about the 8 years, the studio, the scholarship, the small dark life I had called freedom, the cold marble weeks, the locked room, and about how I had come into this house with a plan to watch her beg, and how she had never once begged, had instead simply agreed to pay, and then paid more than I would ever have had the cruelty to ask. And I understood finally that the revenge I had carried for 8 years had been the whole time a wish wearing a knife's clothing. The wish to be seen at last by the one person who had refused to see me, to have her look straight at what I was and admit out loud that it had always been real. And she had done exactly that, in front of 300 people, at the cost of her entire world. The knife had got what it actually wanted, and discovered that what it had wanted was never blood. It was the truth, said out loud, by her. And now I had it, and I had to decide what a person does with a wound after the thing she needed from it has finally, impossibly arrived. She just stood beside me and looked at the painting, the real thing in the ruin, and after a long time she said, "I'm sorry. Not so you'll forgive me. I know it doesn't work like that. You of all people know a thing can be both restored and still bear the wound. Just because it's true, and you should hear it from me sober, in private, with nothing left to gain. I'm sorry. For the studio, for the scholarship, for 8 years, for letting her buy you. You were the best thing I ever saw, and I tried to put your eye out because I could not bear to be seen by it. And I did the thing I had not let myself do in 8 years. I took my own ruined masterpiece down off the wall. The woman I had brought back to life, the proof of my eye, the wound I had been keeping as carefully as Cressida had. And I looked at her, the alpha who broke me and confessed me and burned down 200 years rather than make me lie. And I said the only thing left that was true. You don't get my forgiveness because you understand now why you needed it. You get it because you finally did a true thing when a lie would have saved you. And a person who can learn to choose the real over the perfect is a person worth mending. I'm not the charity case you broke. I never was. I'm the best eye in the country, and I'm telling you professionally that you are not beyond saving. You're a wreck under 3 centuries of your family's overpaint, and I have spent my whole life bringing wrecks like you back to what they actually were. But you don't get to be restored by me unless you choose the real thing every single time from now on, even when it costs you everything, the way you did tonight. That's the deal. That's the only deal I have ever offered anyone. Choose what's real. And Cressida Aldermoor, who had spent her whole life faking an eye and finally thrown it away for one true thing, chose what was real, and has chosen it every day since. It is 2 years now since the centenary. The House of Aldermoor is gone, and good riddance. The marble hall on the Grand Square is a hotel now, and Augusta died in the winter, unforgiven by the one grandchild she had built into a weapon, and never once into a person. Cressida does not authenticate anymore. She will never have the eye, and she has stopped pretending, which is the bravest thing she ever did. But it turns out the most gifted copyist of her generation, once she stops using the gift to lie, is something the world actually needs. She makes the finest exhibition reproductions in the country now, the ones museums hang so the real and fragile originals can rest in the dark, and she signs every one of them after. Honestly, a copy that admits it is a copy, which is its own kind of confession made daily, in oil. She works under my eye. I tell her what is real. She makes it live again for the people who will never get to stand in front of the real thing. We are, it turns out, the 2 halves of one honest trade. The eye that sees what is real, and the hand that can give it back to the world. And we should always have been, and would have been 8 years sooner, if her grandmother had not taught her that being seen by me was the thing to fear instead of the thing to want. My mother lived to see my name go up on the door of her own shop, and that is the thing I am proudest of in the whole story. She had spent 30 years teaching me to hide the eye that made me worth anything, and she got to stand in the doorway of a real conservation studio, her framing shop made whole, and watch the great houses that had once driven past with the doors locked send their wounded masterpieces to a woman named Roan, by name, in the light. She was not a woman who said much, and I understood that she had been waiting my whole life to be proven wrong about that one thing, and that I had finally, at 28, made her wrong, and that it was the best gift I would ever give her. My mother's framing shop is a real conservation studio now. My name on the door at last, the best eye in the country no longer working in the dark. Because the woman who taught me to hide my face on my work spent 200 years worth of her family's reputation in one night, teaching the whole trade my name. The ruined 17th century woman hangs in the studio where we both work. The first thing you see when you come in, restored and wounded and alive, 400 years old and the truest thing either of us owns. Cressida looks at her every day. So do I. Neither of us has ever needed to say what she is for. She is the proof that a real thing can survive being called a fake by the people who own the room. She is the proof that you can be ruined and brought back and still bear the wound and be, because of the wound and not despite it, the best thing in the building. The alpha who told me at 19 that I had no eye for anything real spent everything she had, 8 years later, to tell 300 people the opposite, and then spent 2 years proving she meant it, one honest copy at a time. I came into her dying house to watch her beg. I stayed because I am the best restorer in the country, and I know a wreck worth saving when I see one. And because the one thing my eye has never been able to do is unsee a real thing once it has finally shown itself. Her name is Cressida Aldermoor. My name is Maeve Roan, and it is on the door now. The house is ash. The painting is alive. The eye she tried to put out is the only reason either of us can see in the dark. And we have decided, the forger and the eye, to spend the rest of our lives telling each other nothing but the truth. If you stayed to the end of this one, thank you. These stories take a long time to tell the right way, and you gave me an hour. And I know what an hour is worth. If you want the parts I could not tell here, the cold house, the locked room, the things said in front of the painting, the uncensored version, it is on the Patreon, link in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe so the next quiet woman's story finds you. And if someone with a name and a room ever told you that you have no eye for anything real, believe me, as the best eye in the country, the people who own the room are the most afraid of the ones who can see straight through it. Keep seeing. Keep your eye. It is the one thing they can never buy, and the only thing that was ever going to set you free.